All right, so let's start by taking a look at the warm-up where we kind of review some of the basics of the male reproductive system. So we can preview. All right, so
Hello.
hello. Oh, Sakai is here. Okay. So,
Okay.
all right, so let's take a look here. If we take a look, we have a male pelvis medially sectioned, and there's a variety of tubes. And each of the tubes is kind of doing something else. So what is our tube A here? What's it pointing to? And again, the hint is it's coming from up here someplace.
The ureter.
That's the ureter. That's carrying the urine from the bladder from the kidneys to the bladder. So that's the ureter. Then B is this thing going from the testes to behind the bladder. So what does that got to be?
Vas deferens.
That's the vas deferens or the ductus deferens. And then finally, there's the tube going through the penis from the bladder. Actually, I should make that yellow, shouldn't I?
Urethra.
Yeah, that's the urethra, and that's like where the pee comes out there. So those are the three things there.
Should we differentiate between the penile urethra?
Yeah, ultimately, it's you should know those. Penile urethra or spongy urethra is the one along the shaft of the penis. Prostatic urethra, that's the one where all of the components of the semen are mixing up together. And the membranous urethra, that's basically the pelvic floor that has like the sphincters that are like the voluntary sphincter that squeezes at the bottom of the prostatic urethra.
Okay.
All right, let's clear those and continue to the next. And this little dude is, so it says the two regions that, so the spongy tissue, and we're going to see the spongy tissue in the female today as well, except instead of engorging the penis, you're going to have like the clitoris becoming erect. But we're still going to have the two regions of spongy tissue that run along the shaft of the penis and anchor on the pelvis are
Cavernosum.
corpus cavernosum, or plural would be corpus cavernosa. And again, we're going to see that same thing in the female, except they're going to, in the female, there'll also be crura, the kind of legs, and then they come and they'll merge up and become kind of the body of the clitoris. And then the region that envelops the urethra and goes into the glands is the
corpus spongiosum.
Exactly, the corpus spongiosum. And what is the function of the interstitial cells of Leydig?
Makes testosterone.
Yeah, totally, they make testosterone. So that's one of, when we think about kind of what are the core things that your testes, a male's testes are doing. One is testosterone, and these are the little cells that are kind of in the soft tissue in between the seminiferous tubules. That's why they're called interstices, the spaces in between. Whereas these big tubes here.
Oh, wait, I can remember.
What's that? Oh, we got Tanya now here. What are these large tubes here with, in hint, they're full of things with tails.
Seminiferous tubules.
They're the seminiferous tubules, and they're making the sperm. So the sperm are being nurtured along by these Sertoli cells or nurse cells that make up the walls of these things. And by the time you go through the spermatogenesis to make the sperm, spermiogenesis, the remodeling into the actual little sperms, and then they go off into the epididymis and ultimately out the vas deferens and all that. Continuing. Name the two glands whose secretions make up the bulk of the semen.
Prostate gland and seminal vesicle.
Exactly. The prostate gland and the seminal vesicles. Those are making like 90% of that white goo that the guy ejaculates when he has an orgasm. And, you know, the stuff coming from the testes with the sperm, that's just a small amount. That's like maybe 10% of the overall volume. Again, when a guy has a vasectomy, kind of male sterilization, you cut the vas deferens, you're not adding in any sperm or anything, but it still looks like the same goo that's coming out. So that is our little review of the male. What we're going to do now is go to the female side of this all. And it will be a little more involved because not only is the female making gametes and providing ways to connect gametes, but obviously also there's the whole thing of providing a place for a fetus to develop into a baby. So, and then there's a lot of coordination between all of that. So there's going to be a lot more going on. Like the ovary is going to be way more complicated. You know, in the testes, you got things making some sperm and things making testosterone, and check, we got the testes taken care of. For the ovaries, it's going to be much more involved. So we might as well just start with the ovaries. So ovary. So obviously the ovaries do not descend down into outside the body. They stay up in the pelvic cavity. Kind of like almond shaped. Although bigger than almond, like twice as big as an almond. They have, I don't think anybody knows why they have this epithelium. They have like a cuboidal epithelium along the outside called the germinal epithelium. You know, I'll put it in for completeness. I don't think anybody, it's not clear exactly what it's up for. Then the ovary has a dense connective tissue outer part. And it's got the same name as the dense CT that's around the testes. Does anyone remember what the name of the dense CT around the testes was?
Tunica albugenia, or
Exactly. Tunica albugenia. Means like the white tunic. Now, where things are going to get really different is the egg, the ovum, is got a very different kind of life cycle than the sperm. So maybe let me go into another page here just for a moment. We'll come back to the ovary in a few minutes. If you remember in like spermatogenesis, you had a spermatogonium. And then it divided and replaced itself. And then we had a primary spermatocyte committed into meiosis, which went to 2 cell divisions. And we ended up with 4 little genetically unique haploid sperm. So that was the whole deal. And that's just kind of going on and on. Every time a spermatogonium like commits one daughter cell into spermatogenesis, it replaces itself. So there's another one ready for the next round. Oogenesis, on the other hand, is very different. So the oogonia, these little stem cells that produce eggs, these are only in the fetus. So they are dividing, they commit. And in fact, and when they start, when we have, we're going to end up with what are called primary oocytes. And actually, when the primary oocytes, when you're born, all of your eggs are already stalled out in the beginning of meiosis as primary oocytes. So every egg that you ovulate throughout your life actually kind of got started before you were born and then got kind of, put on hold and then got reactivated to continue meiosis. Because the egg has to have all of the nutrients and all of the organelles and everything to provide nutrition and everything this developing fetus or developing pre-embryo needs for the first week of life, it's a really big cell. I mentioned the egg is visible to the naked eye even. So when it does go through meiosis, every time it divides, one cell will get the lion's share of the cytoplasm, and then you'll get like a little thing with a little nucleus. When this divides for the second cell division, again, so you end up with basically one viable, actually mature ovum at the end of this whole process. These little things, these little throwaways are called polar bodies. And actually this final stage of cell division doesn't happen until the after ovulation already even, and when the sperm meets up with it. So we're not going to get into that. But the beginning of this is going to happen in the ovary at the beginning of the cycle. And so this process here, going from our primary oocyte to a mature ovum that's going to ovulate, there's more we need to talk about that even. Because I mentioned last time that the egg is never on its own. It's always got these additional cells that it's bundled with. So let's introduce the idea of the follicle.
Dr. Eager, what happens to the polar bodies? Where do those go?
They just kind of come along for the ride. They kind of just degenerate, and they just kind of, you can actually sometimes, as the egg is dividing, you can see these little doohickeys kind of glommed up on the side of the egg that were these throwaway nuclei. So follicle. So this is the ovum or the oocytes and supporting cells. Cells. All right, so when you are born, we have what are called primordial follicles. And it's basically, it's primary oocyte. So again, that's that oocyte that has committed into meiosis, but now is stalled out. And then there are these flattened cells around it. They're called follicular cells. And you've got like 100,000 of these. So you're born in your ovary, in the cortex of the ovary, cortex in the outer part of the ovary. There are like 100,000 of these little things. Again, if we go back into this picture now. Oh, actually, I want to double make sure I got blue. So I have like little oocytes everywhere. And each of them have the little follicular cells around them. So again, you are born, all of the eggs have started meiosis, stalled out, wrapped up in these little follicular cells and sitting in the cortex waiting, ultimately waiting till you hit menarche, the beginning of kind of sexual maturity and ovulation and all that. And then once you have passed menarche, sexual maturity, and every month there's going to be a rise of follicle stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland, right? And follicle stimulating hormone, true to its name, is going to stimulate these follicles to start developing into the next stages of follicular development. So we have this primordial follicle. So under the influence of FSH, it's going to go through a few different stages. The first stage is these flattened follicular cells start becoming cuboidal and more multi-layered as well. So this is now called a primary follicle, as opposed to primordial follicle. And the cells that are surrounding it are no longer called follicular cells. They are now called granulosa cells. There are also cells from the connective tissue in the ovary called thecal cells that are also important parts of the follicle. It turns out that the thecal cells and the granulosa cells work together to make estrogen. I think it's the thecal cells actually make testosterone, and then the granulosa cells convert the testosterone into estrogen. So this thing here is starting to develop. This is also starting to produce estrogen. It's gonna be important because the estrogen is what's gonna tell the uterus, like it's time to start getting the walls ready in case there's a possible pregnancy. It's like an egg is developing, start providing a nice little home for this thing if it gets fertilized. So this is this first step. It continues growing. As it continues growing, it gets bigger, and you start getting breaks between, so you have the granulosa cells, but then you also start getting these kind of fluid-filled spaces in between. So it's not just a solid ball of cells. It's actually starting to fill with this fluid in there, in between the cells. This is now called a secondary follicle. And then it continues. That fluid space starts getting more and more predominant until the whole thing is like a big bubble or blister. So we started kind of with, again, kind of primordial follicle with just these flattened cells around it. Then we got our primary follicle, which has the egg and just with things around it. Secondary follicle where we have the egg, and we've also got kind of fluid spaces. And the final step is going to be called the Graphian follicle. Sometimes it's a vesicular follicle, the mature follicle. This is big. The egg is kind of just off on the side. And this is all fluid in here. That fluid-filled space is called the antrum. The egg is surrounded by cells. The little cells that are still the granulosa cells that are around the egg itself are called the corona radiata. Right, those were the cells that even after the egg is ovulated that keep the sperm from actually getting to the egg. That's why the sperm needs that acrosome to kind of digest through this corona radiata so it can actually fertilize the egg. There's some other cool words if you're not responsible for, but like the little mound that the egg is attached to the wall of the follicle it's called the cumulus oophorus, the mound of the egg. I've just always thought that's a cool term. So this, and while this is happening, this is releasing estrogen. And also this takes about 2 weeks. From primary follicle to Graphian follicle is about 2 weeks. This is like the first half of the cycle. In the ovary, FSH is going up and follicle is developing into this. And does anyone remember what triggers ovulation?
Luteinizing hormone.
Yeah, luteinizing hormone. There's a spike in LH and this whole follicle pops. This probably makes more sense to go back to our other picture here. So some primordial follicle starts developing into a primary follicle, into a secondary follicle. And finally, we have this whole big thing. The Graphian follicle is sitting on the side of the ovary. Again, literally like a little blister. I think it's like a ½ centimeter across or so. So here's my Graphian follicle. Here's my little egg with its corona radiata. This is all fluid filled. This is all the antrum. And I should also mention at the beginning, as FSH is going up, a number of primordial follicles begin this journey, begin this development. As it continues, most of them fall by the wayside and start degenerating. There's a term, they call it atresia. I'm not quite sure where the word comes from even. Atresia is this concept that a bunch of them start, but only one make it all the way to the end to become this mature Graafian follicle getting ready to ovulate. And obviously, we're talking about humans right now. In fact, most of the slides that I have to show you later in the lab time are actually from cats. You know, why is a cat ovary going to be a lot easier to see all the different stages of follicular development under the microscope?
It's a lot smaller.
Because they have more than one in the litter.
Exactly. You know, cats have litters rather than, you know, for a human, only one of these Graafian follicles is going to get created and ovulated each month. But a cat, there's a bunch, right? Because cats have a bunch of eggs because they have a bunch of little kittens in one litter. So when you slice through a cat ovary, you're more likely to get a nice section through a number of follicles in different stages because they've got more going all at once. So LH, when LH comes, then this thing pops. Ovulation. The egg is going on a journey. So the egg is going to go off and hopefully get swept up into the fallopian tubes. We'll talk more about its ultimate destiny later. So that's ovulation. But these cells that are left over in the ovary are not done. They have a whole other role to play now. The word corpus luteum comes, luteinizing hormone, I should say. It gets its name because these cells now become a new structure called the corpus luteum. Luteum means yellow body because it's got these lipid inclusions. So this whole big crazy follicle that ovulated, those cells restructure themselves to become the corpus luteum.
This is all still in the ovary?
Yes, this is all in the ovary. So this is 2 weeks in. This is like, you know, at 2 weeks into the cycle. So, you know, on day 1 of the cycle, some of these primordial follicles start turning, growing. 2 weeks in, we have a complete Graafian follicle, spike in luteinizing hormone, and the egg gets popped out. And then these cells that are remaining in the ovary restructure into this corpus luteum, and this produces progesterone. And this is what maintains the uterine lining. Right. The follicle, on the other hand, makes estrogen. Which kind of develops the uterine lining. we will talk about this in much more detail. The uterine lining, also called the endometrium. All right, so I think we've got the basics of the ovary here. People talk about the ovarian cycle. We're going to talk about that as we go along in more detail, and then we're going to tie it into the uterine cycle. But basically, the ovarian cycle is just going to be over the course of day 1, day 14, and it can vary from woman to woman, but somewhere around this. We have the follicular phase, where the follicle is developing. At day 14, there's ovulation. And then the second part is going to be the luteal phase, where that corpus luteum is making progesterone. And we're going to see the corpus luteum degenerates after a week and a half if there's no pregnancy. So we're going to come back to this ovarian cycle, and we're going to see how it syncs up with the uterine cycle in a little bit. All right, so I think we're done with the ovaries. Now we're going to do is put the ovary in the larger context of the uterus and the fallopian tubes and all of that. Okay. So here were the ovaries. This is kind of a stinky picture here. So this is kind of more now of the, so let's say this is the vaginal opening here. Vaginal opening leads up into this vaginal canal. We'll get more into the external genitalia later. But for right now, let's stay here up in the internal part. The vaginal canal leads up to the uterus, AKA womb. When people talk about the womb, it's like the uterus. This is going to be the place where the fetus can develop. In general, I think it's pear-shaped. It's depending if a woman's been pregnant or not. It depends on how large it is. Ultimately, this thing can stretch out to obviously contain the baby that's about to be born. The parts you should know that are named, just like the stomach, that kind of the top rounded part is called the fundus. So that's the fundus of the uterus. This is the cervix of the uterus. Cervix, the neck. It kind of makes sense. It's kind of the neck of the uterus. And then the little tunnel, the hole, where ultimately where the sperm are going to be able to swim up to get up to the egg, or ultimately this hole that's going to dilate enough for a baby to actually exit. This is called the os. The cervical os. Normally, it's really, really just kind of like a hair's breadth. It's really very, very narrow. Like when people are getting procedures like an abortion or something, you can't just kind of go up into the uterus and deal with stuff. You have to widen this. like step by step. They have like these, they call them like laminaria, these little things you can put a little one in, and as it absorbs water, it kind of swells a bit and widens the os. And then you can put the next larger one in, and that absorbs water and swells. And so you can slowly relax. You can't just kind of muscle in there because it's just very tough muscle. The whole uterine wall we're going to talk about in more detail in a few moments. And we'll talk more. Actually, as after the egg is ovulated, this whole area gets blocked off, even like you get a little mucus plug to kind of just seal off the whole inside of the uterus after ovulation to kind of keep things kind of sealed off in case there's going to be a pregnancy in there. So the ovary is here, it ovulated. You hope that the egg gets swept up into these, they can call them fallopian tubes. Or ovarian tubes or oviducts. They got different names. It kind of swells out. There's different names, the ampulla, the infundibulum. The main part you need to know are the fimbri. The fimbri are like these little fingers that reach out and actually try to catch the egg. So this is not like the sperm. The sperm get made, they're made in the seminiferous tubule. And then they get funneled along, and then they're in the rete testes, and then they get funneled along, and then they're in the epididymis. Then they get funneled along, and they're going through the vas deferens, and then they're in the urethra, and then they're going out the tip of the penis. There's no chance for them ever going off course. The egg, on the other hand, is not necessarily directly dumped into the fallopian tube. It gets kind of just like popped out, and then it has to get caught by these little fingers, these little fimbri, and swept up into the fallopian tube. And hopefully moving along, and it will end up here in the uterus where the egg has to implant if it's going to develop properly. It's possible that the egg does not get into the fallopian tube. It's actually not that uncommon for an egg to not get in there, and an egg can get fertilized. So like, I've mentioned last time that sperm live 4 to 5 days. So it could be this woman had sex 4 days ago, and there's like little sperm swimming all around, and the egg gets ovulated, and the egg gets fertilized, but it doesn't go up the fallopian tube, and it just implants in the serous membrane, the mesenteries that are surrounding all of this, which we're going to talk about. And then all of a sudden, this little fertilized egg, this little pre-embryo starts growing, and it can cause all sorts of problems. This thing starts growing, gets bigger and bigger, and can just destroy and rip apart all sorts of structures. Anytime an egg implants and starts growing any place other than in an appropriate place in the uterus, it's called an ectopic pregnancy. This can also be an ectopic pregnancy if the egg gets caught in the fallopian tube and just starts growing there and starts, and obviously it's pretty soon it's going to just rip apart. This fallopian tube is this narrow little thing. You don't want it growing there and ripping apart your fallopian tube. So like whenever a woman of reproductive age gets, into the doctors with, abdominal pelvic pain, they always give them a pregnancy test just to double check that this isn't going on. So it's definitely a very common thing to look out for. So let's assume it's not an ectopic pregnancy. The egg then is going to get swept along the fallopian tubes. There are actually little cilia, little ciliated columnar epithelium that will move the little egg along. If the egg does get fertilized, we'll talk about that in more detail on Thursday, but basically it'll happen actually near the ovary because the egg is only viable for about 12 to 24 hours. And it takes almost a week to ultimately get into the uterus and implant there. So like the first 4 to 7 days or so, the egg gets fertilized, the little pre-embryo is developing, you're getting the first stages of development turning into a new little human. It's on its own, it's just getting swept along. That's why the egg has to be so big. And then ultimately it's going to implant. And we're going to talk about Thursday what it means exactly to implant, but it basically burrows into the uterine wall and starts helping create the placenta and stuff like that. So what we're going to do now is look at a little more detail at the uterus and the wall of the uterus. Okay. So a big part of it is just smooth muscle, which is called the myometrium. So things that have to do with the uterus are metrium. So myometrium is just the smooth muscle. And then the inner wall is going to be called the endometrium. This is going to be the lining. There are two parts to the endometrium. One part that is always there. So there's going to be this kind of more permanent layer. And then there is going to be another layer that grows and sloughs off every month under the influence of these hormones, estrogen and progesterone and all that. So let's talk about, just give those names. So there's going to be this stratum basalis, aka basalis, aka kind of basal layer. And this is always stays. But then there's this other layer here, which is the stratum functionalis. AKA functional layer. And this one, let me put this a little up here. It regrows at beginning of cycle and sloughs off at end. So that's what menses is. The menstrual flow is when this functional layer is breaking apart, and it's a bunch of cells and blood and everything, and it all is just going to kind of pour out the vaginal opening. So we're going to talk about this in more detail in a few moments when we look at the whole connection between the ovarian cycle and this uterine cycle. But basically this stratum functionalis, it has these endometrial glands. Whoops, let me draw that better. They make these glycoproteins that help nourish the little developing preembryo. When we look at the uterine lining, the endometrium under the microscope, when the stratum functionalis is fully mature and secreting, they call it the secretory phase because it's when the little glands are doing their thing. You can see these very well-formed glands in this kind of thick layer. You know, at the end of the month, all you see is just like kind of chaos, just like broken up cells and blood and things like that. The other thing I will add in here for completeness is there is a simple columnar layer of cells that actually cover the very inside of it all. Obviously, that simple columnar is going to also just get swept away in the menstrual flow. So what I'm going to do now is, now that we've kind of added in this idea of the uterus and the endometrium, which has this stratum basal or basal layer that just always stays there. At the beginning of the cycle, this stratum functionalis, this functional layer, regrows, makes a bunch of new little glands. At the end of the cycle, the little blood vessels supplying this start kind of pinching off. All these things start dying off. All this kind of comes apart. The regrowing is under the influence of estrogen. Keeping it going while it's been made is the job of progesterone. And when we see, when the progesterone stops, when the corpus luteum is done, that's when we have the menstrual flow. So let's put this in the picture here now. We had the ovarian cycle where we had, you know, this was in the ovary. The egg, we had like a primordial follicle all the way to a Graafian follicle. We had ovulation, and we had the corpus luteum. So now let's add in the uterine cycle. Actually, let me put that off to the side. So what's going on in the uterus at the same time as all this is happening? So as the follicle develops, the follicle makes estrogen. That estrogen causes the uterine lining to regrow. And so that uterine lining regrowing is going to be called the proliferative phase. So that's the first, and this is actually, we're going to see, this is about day 3, from about day 3 to about day 14. Once we hit the luteal phase, where we're making progesterone here, progesterone maintains the endometrium. And again, at this point, after day 14, the endometrium has regrown. It's ready to go. This is what's called the secretory phase. So glands fully, I should say endometrium fully grown. So that is the secretory phase that is happening. So we have our proliferative phase under the influence of estrogen regrowing the functional layer. The egg is been ovulated. And so this is, you're right, the timing here, right? We're ready to go. We have a fully functional endometrium and the egg has just been sent off for potential fertilization. So we've got a place for it to land. If there is no pregnancy, now we have to go back. I kind of wrote it kind of hard to read here. I'll type it a little better. If no pregnancy, corpus luteum degenerates after a week and a half. So what does that mean? So here, so now we're right around here, the corpus luteum is starting to degenerate. What's going to happen to the progesterone level? Remember, progesterone maintains the uterine lining.
Would it drop?
Yeah, progesterone is now going to drop. So progesterone is going to go down. And all of a sudden, this thing is going to lose cohesion. This is when we're going to start initiating menses. So actually the first few days, like day 1 to 3, this is actually the whole uterine lining coming apart and coming out the vaginal opening. Well, not the whole uterine lining, the functional layer of the uterine lining. So this is what we call the menstrual phase. So when you are having menses, when you are bleeding, that is actually the first few days of your new cycle. That's when in your ovary, the newest follicle is starting to grow. So having the beginning of menses is actually the beginning of the new cycle, but it's the functional layer from the last cycle kind of washing out and getting ready to regrow for the new cycle. So that makes sense? You know, what hormone, does anybody have a sense, what hormone is ultimately going to be pulling the strings on this whole thing?
FSH?
So we have FSH and LH are important to run all this. And what's running FSH and LH even?
Estrogen.
So it's, remember, the hypothalamus is what is actually controlling the pituitary gland. So these are controlled by gonadotropin releasing hormone from the pituitary. So this is like one of the big differences between men and women is in the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone by their hypothalamus. In the guy, gonadotropin releasing hormone just gets pulsed out every few hours. So that means that the guy is just kind of making sperm and making testosterone all the time. In a woman, gonadotropin releasing hormone goes up at the very beginning. That's what starts it all. As it goes up, the follicle stimulating hormone goes up and this all starts. But as long as there's estrogen and progesterone around, they inhibit gonadotropin releasing hormone, keep it down. That's how come in general, you only have one egg developing instead of a whole bunch. So for this whole month, you don't have new gonadotropin releasing hormone because the estrogen and the progesterone both inhibit gonadotropin releasing hormone. So these guys here inhibit. I just erased it so you can't even read it anymore. That was kind of silly. So this and this work to minus sign, keep this down. But at the end of the cycle, when the progesterone, when the corpus luteum is gone, that is going to release the inhibition. And that is yeah, that's not what I meant to do. That is going to cause the gonadotropin releasing hormone to rise again and start the cycle all over again. That's how you get this kind of monthly cycle going on. Next class on Thursday, we're going to see what happens if there is a pregnancy. You know, it turns out if there is a pregnancy, there is a hormone released by the developing embryo called human chorionic gonadotropin, which actually preserves the corpus luteum. I'll write it down just for right now, but we'll look at it again. So it's basically kind of like a little, it's like Horton Hears a Who. We're here, we're here. It's like saying, you know, there's something going on here. What is going to happen if the corpus luteum is preserved and the progesterone levels stay up?
Maintains the pregnancy.
You're pregnant. Yeah, it maintains the pregnancy. And what about the menstrual phase?
Does it happen?
Right, you're not going to have the menstrual phase, right? Because the menstrual phase happens because of the drop in progesterone. When the progesterone goes down, the wall comes apart. So, you know, that's why you miss your period when you're pregnant, because you don't have the corpus luteum degenerating. So the endometrium stays going on, which is what's necessary to support a pregnancy. We'll look at the end of the first trimester of the pregnancy, the placenta is finally fully functional, and actually the placenta will take over making progesterone. And that's also why there's a lot of miscarriages at the end of the first trimester, because sometimes there's a hiccup in that handoff from the corpus luteum to the placenta in keeping the progesterone levels up and therefore keeping the endometrium intact and keeping it all together. So, all right, so that is, and there's a lot of stuff here, but it's kind of cool how it all kind of syncs up together. And the other parts we should talk about are the external. So it's always kind of a funny picture to draw. Yeah, it's kind of like, I don't know. All right, so this is supposed to be, yeah, you the guy, some pubic hair. This is supposed to be the external genitalia. What is the overall term for external female genitalia?
Vulva.
The vulva. Again, and this is kind of more modern. If you look in old books, in old dictionaries as well, they literally call it the pudendum. Pudendum. I'll say archaic, although not that archaic, which comes from the root for shameful, so the female, not just the nerve feeding the genitals was shameful, but just the female genitals themselves were shameful. So kind of right above, there's actually kind of like a little fatty pad under the skin. This is actually, they give it a name. They call it the mons pubis because it's a little raised up there. Mons pubis, also mons veneris, the mound of Venus. Also, the skin on either side are the labia majora. The labia majora are equivalent to the scrotal sac in the guy. In fact, this is what the scrotal sac would be. If the development had gone another way, the testes would descend into this area, and this would be what would be the scrotum. Instead, in a woman, what you get is fascinating. I think just be way. If you look at the uterus has these ligaments to support it, and I'll have to talk a little more about these. But coming off of the uterus are these things called the round ligaments. And they go from the uterus, and they actually go through the inguinal canal, and they anchor in the labia majora. So there's that. We'll talk about a few other of the anchoring things for the uterus in a few moments. So back here, you've got the labia minora. These are hairless, usually darker colored. These are what kind of frame off what we call the vestibule, the kind of little region where you're going to have the vaginal opening and the urethra and the clitoris and all that. That's this kind of area in here. Where the labia minora meet at the top, at the anterior portion, that is going to be the prepuce of the clitoris. So just like the glans penis, the head of the penis had a prepuce, kind of a little skin covering over. The head of the clitoris has the same thing. The clitoris itself is homologous basically to the glands of the penis. So here we have like the glands of the clitoris. So the clitoris It has a glans, just like the head of the penis. And then it also has spongy tissue that also fill it just like the penis had. And it also engorges with blood and becomes more erect during sexual excitation. I'll show you some more of the, in fact, and we have one of the videos, one of the dissection videos shows the corpus cavernosa of the female, but basically you have the same thing, the corpus cavernosa with the crura, and they come together and they create kind of the length of the clitoris, and then there's more spongy tissue in the glands of the clitoris. And the clitoris is just about sexual pleasure. It's just like it's got a bunch of nerve endings for sexual sexual pleasure. We have the vaginal opening here. The urethral opening. This is something I mentioned last time. You have kind of each thing kind of have its own, it's kind of separated. Instead, like the penis is all got all this stuff kind of rolled into this one thing. Here you have the clitoris, you have a urethral opening, a vaginal opening, for combining gametes, for peeing. There is actually a term for where the labia minora meet on the backside. They call it the fourchette. What else do I want to say here? Oh, let's talk a little. We talked about, remember there were the Cowper's glands in the guy, those bulbourethral glands that would do the pre-cum. There is the homologue here, except they feed into right near the entrance to the vagina here. Let me put this maybe on another sheet. I'm going to erase some of this. So kind of coming in right near the entrance to the vagina there, we have what are called the Bartholin glands. Also called greater vestibular glands. So they provide some of the lubrication here, although a lot of the lubrication that happens, like as a woman becomes sexually aroused, just happens because of the vasocongestion. Part of sexual arousal in both men and women is a lot of vasocongestion, a lot of blood flow into the region. And you get filtration as the blood fills into the walls of the vagina or vaginal canal. There's filtration, kind of liquid leaks out. And so a lot of the female lubricating is happening as a result of that vasocongestion, having a lot of blood filling into that region. The walls of the vagina are what kind of epithelium?
Stratified squamous.
Yeah, stratified squamous, obviously for friction. And there's folds. They call them rugae, just like in the stomach, because they are kind of wrinkled up, but then they can kind of stretch out. So more things. Let's talk a little bit more about what kind of anchors all these things together. So if we're looking at the uterus and the fallopian tubes, it's kind of like a moose. The ovaries, vaginal canal. there's a variety of things that kind of stabilize this whole thing. One is there are ligaments that go straight from the ovaries to the side of the uterus, and those are called the ovarian ligaments. And then there are also things that go off to the side of the body wall. They call suspensory ligaments. Again, we talked about there being these round ligaments that go from the uterus to the labia majora ligament. There are also other ones like the cardinal or lateral ligaments, but a major thing that actually supports the uterus in place are the muscles of the pelvic floor. So the muscles of the pelvic floor are important. And in fact, sometimes after giving birth and there's damage to this, the whole uterus can drop down. You can actually see the cervix peeking out through the vaginal opening. And they call that a prolapsed uterus. Prolapsed uterus is if, normally there's the vaginal opening and there's the vagina and then you go up and there's the cervix. But if this whole shebang drops down, you can actually have the cervix poking out the vaginal opening there. Obviously, they have to kind of go and kind of strengthen things up and repair that. If we look at kind of a side view, this would be like butt, leg. So bladder. The bladder this is anterior here. Bladder and urethra. Vaginal canal. Actually, I'm not drawing this so well. Ah! And then the rectum. It's going to come out the other side. So things to think about here. In general, most women have the uterus actually folded forward a little bit. So this would be like anteverted towards the front. This is more typical. But sometimes it actually is folded backward, which case it's called retroverted. And it's nothing wrong or right about it. Some women don't realize they have a retroverted uterus until they try putting on a diaphragm for the first time and realize as they feel up there, it's like, oh my God, my cervix is pointing differently than I thought it was going to be pointing. So, and actually during sexual arousal, part of, like in a guy, it's obvious things are changing because the penis is swelling and getting erect. In a female, though, there is also changes going on, and part of that vasocongestion, the whole uterus actually starts kind of going back, kind of stretching out, elongating the vaginal canal. They have like what do they call it? The orgasmic platform is created. So that's kind of like a side view of this. In the pelvic cavity here, this is supposed to be the serous membrane that's kind of coming down and surrounding everything. So this is kind of just the space of your abdominal pelvic cavity. The little spot in between the bladder and the uterus has a name. It's called the vesicouterine pouch. And then behind here, this spot here between the rectum and the uterus, that one has a special name, and actually says special significance. So this is the rectouterine pouch of Douglas. So the rectouterine pouch of Douglas. And it is kind of the lowest point in the whole abdominal pelvic cavity. So if things are going to settle in, or there's some infection or whatever, this is kind of the low point of gravity in the entire abdominal pelvic cavity in a woman, is this little rectouterine pouch of Douglas. And then the last thing I will say, and then we'll take our break. So I'm kind of showing, this is supposed to be the peritoneum, kind of folding, here's the parietal peritoneum across the body wall. And then it kind of is folding over all of the reproductive organs down here. And we have a name for all of that because it's anatomy. We have to have a name for it. So here we have the ovaries and the fallopian tubes and the uterus. So when you have all that serous membrane coming over, folding over all of it, and it kind of vacuum packs it, like it'll go around, specifically around and suck around the fallopian tubes, or kind of suck around the ovaries. So the overall term for the serous membrane that covers everything, it's called the broad ligament. Again, this word ligament, it's kind of like the falciform ligament is not really a ligament. It's a serous membrane around the liver. The broad ligament is not a ligament. It's serous membrane wrapping around the female reproductive organs. It has different names. You're not responsible for all the different names, but I'll give them to you. The mesovarium is around the ovaries. The mesometrium is around the uterus. The part around the fallopian tubes has kind of a cool name. It's called the mesosalpinx. And it's about trumpets, because if you think about a fallopian tube, it looks kind of like a trumpet. So again, when we get to the lab part, we have pictures and models and things that will show all this in better detail. But for right now, just think about this idea that when you're in the bottom of the pelvic cavity here, the serous membrane kind of folds down and envelops the uterus, the ovary, the fallopian tubes, and that whole shebang of serous membrane enveloping all that is the broad ligament. And the different areas of the broad ligament, get names, but that's like saying this is my shirt, but yes, it has sleeves and a collar and whatever, but it's still a hoodie, right? The broad ligament is the broad term for it. So are there any comments, questions before we take our break? All right, so how about 2:45? We will come back and we will look at some of this in real cadavers. We'll look at some of it in models, and we'll look at some of it under the microscope. The one last thing that we usually cover in female reproductive that I didn't mention, or just briefly mention, are mammary glands. So let's do that. And then we will get into the labby stuff. So basic idea. So, normally, you have pectoralis major as the muscle on your chest there. And then in a woman, the breasts and the mammary glands, it's mainly just adipose. But then you have these glands that are in there that all feed out into the nipple. So the mammary glands and they're actually modified apocrine sweat glands, which is always kind of cool to think about. When you think about mother's milk, it's actually modified sweat. And the nipple has an area that's kind of more around, around it called the areola, which just means little area. And again, the nipple is where the actual little glands all feed into. There are connective tissue ligaments that support the breast, and they are called the suspensory ligaments. At least one, I don't know if she still does it, but in some of the earlier editions of Marib, she would say, it's like nature's own little bra. So they're basically keeping the breasts supported there. And obviously, mammary glands are not always active. And in fact, both men and women have mammary glands. It's just in men, they don't get activated. Although at least prior to puberty, I know that they can become active under the appropriate hormones. But we talked about hormones that affect mammary glands and kind of turn them on, get them online, like prolactin to kind of wake them up, and oxytocin to kind of squeeze out the milk and all that. So that's that. So let's look at some histology instead, and then we'll come back to the gross anatomy. So this is in the module for today. I added two things in. One of them is female reproductive histology photo micrographs, and the other one are cadaver dissections. So we'll start with the histology. And this is ovary. And these are the little itsy bitsy primordial follicles. So here we are in the cortex, in the outer part of the ovary. These are all cat ovaries because they are way easier to show all the things and find all the things. So, but basically right here, each of these things is a primary oocyte. Again, and that already committed to its meiotic divisions in utero. And then you can see these really squamous cells. Each one is just surrounded by really flat cells. You don't really see, again, here are these little squamous cells surrounding it. So these are primordial follicles. And again, you're born with, I think, somewhere like 100,000 of them. If I go down here, This is kind of showing a larger picture of the entire ovary with all the different things going on. And if you look in this, what you'll notice is there are just tons of them, all these little dots everywhere, all around the outside here. Those are all primordial follicles. We were just zoomed way in on one of them or on a few of them, but they're all over the place. And again, at the beginning of each cycle, under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, you're going to have a few of these little itsy bitsy dudes start going through that process where those follicular cells turn cuboidal, become granulosa cells, going into, in fact, right here we can see a secondary follicle where we're starting to get all sorts of fluid spaces in here. Over here, we're seeing approaching a Graafian follicle where we have this whole antrum and the egg here surrounded by the corona radiata. So the basic idea is these are always here, and at the beginning of each month, some of them start going through these phases to become secondary, totally mature follicle, and ultimately that egg is going to be ovulated. So whoop, I meant to clear my drawings. So if we go back up, again, primordial follicles. This is showing them starting to go into that primary follicle. Now you can all of a sudden see the egg is starting to enlarge and the cells surrounding it are starting to become more cuboidal rather than flattened. So right over here, we have the little primordial follicles. This one is starting the journey towards becoming a mature follicle.
Is that the secondary follicle? Like that?
No, this one here, this would be secondary. Because here we're starting to get all of these fluid spaces starting to appear.
So that was just the first one then.
Yeah, that one was like a primary follicle. So primary follicle is you just start getting cuboidal cells around, but they're not starting to get those fluid spaces in between yet. And here we're getting the fluid spaces in between. So now we're getting into secondary follicle territory. And, it depends on what book you're reading. They'll use different terms for the different stages. I'll also put that out there. There's not necessarily a totally consistent terminology through all this. Here we're getting into, the Graafian follicle where you have the egg, which I'm kind of circling with the mouse. The corona radiata, these are the cells that are surrounding the egg that will continue. They'll surround it after it's ovulated as well. Some of those enzymes in the acrosome are going to help the sperm get through these cells, as well as the zona pellucida, this kind of other layer that surrounds the egg as well. So you should be able to look at this and know you're in an ovary. You should be able to know the difference between a primordial follicle versus like a Graafian follicle or a secondary follicle. So, I would feel comfortable putting an ovary on an exam because they have very distinctive looking cells and the follicles at different stages of development. This is getting into the uterus now. This is showing kind of the whole thing. The myometrium, the smooth muscle that's kind of at a deeper level. And here is the endometrium, the layer. And again, the endometrium, the part that is, maybe I should get my little annotator again. This part at the base, this is that basal layer, the one that never goes away. But above it, all of this stuff, this is this functional layer. Here you can see this is actually at the secretory phase. It's all full of these little glands in here. And all of this is just going to become dying cells and blood. That's all going to all become the menstrual flow during menses, but not yet. So, but let's say that happened. That's all gone. And now we're just back to this basal layer. This is going to start regrowing at the beginning of the cycle. And that is what we see on the next slide here. So this is that proliferative phase. And you know you're in the proliferative phase because the endometrium is looking intact. It doesn't look like kind of a chaotic, like things just blew apart. But it also doesn't have this big thick layer full of glands like this. It's pretty thin. Like, you know, the myometrium, a little bit a layer of stuff that is kind of well formed, but still just starting out. Where if you look at like the secretory phase, wait, this is not, this is probably more let me get rid of this one. I'll get rid of that. Here is secretory phase where you can see here we're just starting to grow. Here we got a really big, well-developed like bunch of glands up above the myometrium. You know, and I was rushing trying to find, I didn't have my own slides of these. So I was looking for ones online. These aren't beautiful, but they're still showing what you need to see, kind of the thickness of the endometrium, and all these glands are very distinct in the secretory phase. And in the menstrual phase, you know, it's just everything has fallen apart. Things are all kind of starting to disintegrate. And in fact, and I couldn't find, again, this is in lab, we have some beautiful images of a menstrual phase uterus, but these are kind of giving you a sense, at least, of the endometrium is starting to disintegrate and fall apart. You know, and then after that, you're going to come back to the proliferative phase where it's going to start regrowing again. And then it'll be secretory phase where it's got big, well-developed glands, thick layer. And then boom, it'll disintegrate again and it's menses, and then it'll come back and proliferative phase and it'll regrow, like on and on and on. This is showing a little bit of the fallopian tube. So the fallopian tube, the lumen is not clean. It's not just, it sounds like a tube, and it is a tube, but it's a tube with a really kind of convoluted and folded up looking lumen. So this is just kind of giving you some sense that the lumen isn't really just kind of a circle. But what this does show are these little ciliated cells, which again are there to take the little developing preembryo and kind of start sweeping it along on its journey towards the uterus where it can implant and start developing. So that is that. This is pictures of the vaginal wall. Again, classic stratified squamous epithelium. Then the lamina propria is kind of just this connective tissue. It's, again, highly vascularized. Lots of blood vessels that engorge, but basically it's a mucosa, a stratified squamous epithelium on a layer of connective tissue. So, you know, you should recognize ovaries and the different phases of follicular development. You should actually know the different layers of the endometrium. You should know there's the myometrium, which is smooth muscle, endometrium, which is this layer that grows and sloughs off and regrows, and the different stages. You maybe, let me take a look. It could be that the Minnesota thing has some good pictures of it. Let's take a look at Minnesota. The slide box. Female reproductive system. All right, let's take a look what we got. Oh, so it's worth looking at the oviduct. Here you can really see it's not a clean circle for a lumen. It's a crazy convoluted thing in there, but that's what it looks like. But if we go in closer and closer and closer, you'll see little ciliated cells and stuff that sweep things along. Let's see. Oh, I can show you what a corpus luteum looks like. So this weird looking thing is the corpus luteum. You do not need to recognize a corpus luteum. So don't worry about the corpus luteum. This is showing a Graafian follicle here. And you can see it kind of on the edge. And women can sometimes, I mean, I've talked to people who can actually know which ovary ovulated. It usually alternates month to month, the right versus the left. There's this German word, Mittelschmerz, which means like, pain in your middle, where women often feel like a pinch and they know that they just ovulated, that this little follicle burst and the egg is now on its journey. So it's kind of wild. Here we have uterus in different phases. Let's see how, okay, so here, proliferative phase is kind of getting started. It's got a nice clean looking to it, although it doesn't have that big tons of crazy swirly glands yet. If we go to kind of the secretory phase, here you can see a much more developed set of glands with all these little swirly glands in there up above the myometrium. Again, here you can just compare, look at the glands here, all this crazy glandular stuff. If we go back to the proliferative phase, it's just getting started, right? We're just starting. Here's this basal layer starting to regrow. We've got that little simple columnar epithelium up there. You can actually probably see that. Yeah, there's that simple columnar epithelium on the very lining the lumen there. But just getting started. And again, like, oh my God, what a collection of uterine glands to provide nutritious little glycolipids for the little developing preembryo, right? It's just so much more going on. And then if there is no progesterone, as the progesterone drops, as the corpus luteum degenerates, here we go. Yeah, this is good. Here you can see it's like, oh my God, it's all falling apart. So this is menstrual phase. It used to be full of these lovely glands, and now it's like a whole bunch of cells and blood that are going to start pouring out the vaginal canal. And then, but leaving this basal layer here from which to regrow the new endometrium, for the next cycle. Endometriosis or endometrial cysts are when you have tissue that is not lining your uterus, that actually responds to the cycling of hormones in your body. It actually it grows and sloughs, but it's not inside your uterus. It might be like on the outside of your uterus or someplace. And it can be really painful as it goes and does its thing. So they'll often go in and try to get, burn it off and stuff like that. So it's not causing problems. So Yeah, you are not responsible for recognizing mammary gland or umbilical cord or placenta or cervix for that matter. But yeah, so actually I am relieved. The uterine cycle is pretty clear in this Minnesota slide box, which again is, right at the base, that module that I have at the bottom, histology resources, virtual histology lab, University of Minnesota. That's where you can find that. All right, I'm going to try to go back into the complete anatomy because I would like to show some stuff in there before we do the cadavers, because I think it clarifies things when you can see it as a model before you see like the real world, which is really messy. So let's do it. And hopefully I go relatively smoothly. All right. And all right, I am booting it up. I'm going to share, you share. Maybe if I restore my old session, maybe it works. Yes, woohoo. All right, so, oh my God, I'm so happy about this. So this is showing the uterus here. Here's the, saying myometrium. Here's the bladder. These are these round ligaments. You can see it's coming off of the uterus here. And it's going down what would be the inguinal canal. And it's anchoring here in the labia majora, right? If we turn on the integumentary system, right? Here's just the vulva. Here's the labia majora. So if we like fade, can we fade the skin? So labia majora, and we fade that. You can see that there is that round ligament just anchoring right down in there. Right, so it's just coming right in there. So let's turn off the integumentary system. Other things that are interesting that you can see here, the ovarian ligament. Talked about that little ligament that connects the ovary to the uterus. So there is the ovarian ligament, this little ligament that helps support the ovary on the side of the uterus there. This is also showing the fallopian tubes or ovarian tubes or uterine tubes. No, so uterine tubes, the fimbriae, the little fingers that reach out and hopefully grab the egg as it pops out. And there are different names. You're not going to be tested on them. Where it narrows is the isthmus, where it expands is the ampulla, the funnel-like area is the infundibulum, but you should just know it's the fallopian tube or the uterine tube, and that the little fimbriae are the little fingers that scoop up the egg. Other things in the model that is useful. So here we are looking again at the vulva. Here's the prepuce of the clitoris. Again, right, the foreskin of the clitoris. We're going to hide that. And now we can see the clitoris. And you can see that the clitoris is actually connected to these corpus cavernosas. So here's like the crust of that. The leg, here's the body of the clitoris, which again is these two corpus cavernosas coming in and pairing together. Here's the glans clitoris, just like the penis had the glans penis. This is more from this other spongy tissue. Again, all of this engorges with blood during the vasocongestion during arousal. One difference in the guy, there was that corpus spongiosum, which became like the bulb at the bottom of the penis. In the woman, you've got these kind of two structures. The bulb of the vestibule is actually two structures, but that are also spongy tissue that fill with blood. You know, this is also showing the little Bartholin glands. So like this is supposed to be the vaginal canal leading up into the uterus. And here you can see these two little glands, these little Bartholin glands here are secreting right into the entrance of the vaginal canal. So we got that going for us. Let's see what we got here. No, that's where I messed up. This is not, okay, so now I know I'm gonna get one other thing now. I'm going to get female pelvis. What? That's not a female pelvis. You should, I mean, although for review, if I had this on a test, you should be able, even though it's kind of weird looking, you should be able, what is this? Oh, I just gave you the name.
Erector pili.
A rector pili muscle to give you goosebumps. Right. All right. But okay, let me get back. Like, hey, look, a squirrel. Let's go back and we're going to turn on the reproductive structures. And now what I want to do, all right, let's get rid of this umbilical. This is actually kind of interesting. This umbilical ligament, or urachus, I think it's called. It actually is a remnant from like fetal development, and it goes from the bladder to the umbilicus, the belly button. And normally it closes off, but there are cases in both men and women where it doesn't totally close off, and you can actually have like urine leaking out of your belly button, which is kind of hilarious. It sounds hilarious, yeah, unless it's you. All right, so what I want to kind of show now is the broad ligament. So I'm going to add in the connective tissue here. Boom, there we go. So what we've just done here is, and I'm going to hide some stuff to make it easier to see. So this is showing how you have all of those structures now kind of like a vacuum packed in serous membrane, the bottom of the peritoneum. Do you all see that? Right, so if I go like look underneath in there, that's the vesicouterine pouch. There's the bladder. So between the bladder and the uterus is the vesicouterine pouch. If I go, let's add in the digestive tract. We've got the colon and the rectum there now. In fact, let's just slice this. I think I can do this. Tools, cut many layers, and go right up the middle. And then let's get rid of all the stuff let's turn off the tool. Get rid of the stuff we don't want. We're going to hide. Hide multi-selection and select area. I've been figuring out tricks in this thing. Woo! Okay, so now this is nice. We can actually look at this cross section here. Here you can really see how the uterus is anteverted. This is more typical, just leaning forward, and the cervix is actually pointing backwards like this. So here's a vaginal canal, here's the labia minora, here's a vaginal opening going in. And here you can see right back here, this is that pouch of Douglas, the rectouterine pouch, kind of right between the bladder, the uterus and the rectum. Here's a little Bartholin gland feeding in right near at the entrance of the vaginal canal. So cool. So I think that's kind of what I wanted you all to see. You can see the spongy tissue here that makes up the clitoris, which again, you can see on the cadaver dissection that's coming up, and those different peritoneal coverings that make up the broad ligament, which you can also see really nicely on the cadaver dissections coming up. So let's go to the cadaver dissections coming up. Where? Okay, hold on. I have to find the appropriate screen to share. Wait, where is it? Hold on, something got weird here. Oh, I think this is it. Okay. So what we're going to do now, we're going to go up to where I said cadaver dissections, female. This is the same videos, except different parts of the videos that we saw on Thursday. So instead of looking at a male pelvis, we're going to look at a female pelvis. It starts with just kind of a nice view of the broad ligament. Then I wrote here, not for the squeamish. I'll play it. Or maybe I'll skip. You can watch it on your own if you want. It's like he literally like takes a saw and just goes through this, dead woman's pelvis. It's a little, even for me, it's like, whoa. But then after he's got her cut in half, there's a nice section of, or a nice view of the median section structures. And then we'll go into the perineum where you can see the spongy tissue. So let's start here.
Dissection is a splitting of the pelvis in order to look at the mid-sagittal section of the pelvis in male and female. What I'm going to do first before demonstrating that, though, is to go through some of the viscera and some of the peritoneal reflections on this female cadaver. For orientation, the aorta and aortic bifurcation are located here. The pubic symphysis is anterior. In the midline, with the string tied around the transected sigmoid colon becoming the rectum.
So do you know why you tie the string around there?
Like a poop.
Yeah, there's poop. I mean, that's where, it gets stinky. It's actually, you really try not to cut through that or break that open unless you definitely need to. And then you want to be very careful when you do it because it can be really unpleasant.
The uterus and the urinary bladder. So parietal peritoneum that lines the anterior abdominal wall continues over the urinary bladder, dips down into a recess and then is reflected back up onto the fundus and a portion of the body of the uterus. So this rounded portion here is the fundus. Then it continues down around the inner surface or undersurface of the uterus to continue down into the pelvic basin before sweeping back up onto the rectum and to the posterior abdominal wall. So let me go back and identify those recesses. Right in here between the uterus and the bladder is the uterovesical pouch. More important clinically, because it's the inferior most extent of the peritoneal cavity, would be the pouch recess that is between the uterus and the rectum, or the recto-uterine pouch. So down on the floor here, this deep concavity is the recto-uterine pouch. Epinym for that is pouch of Douglas. The peritoneum that covers the uterine fundus and the body of the uterus that we see on either side here is continued laterally to help suspend the uterus in the midline, and it's the lateral reflections of the peritoneum around the structures that are attached to the margin of the uterus that are called the broad ligament. I'm going to go through and demonstrate some of those structures for you on this right side. One structure is the round ligament of the uterus that you see attached to the side wall near the fundus, continues into the deep inguinal ring, and we studied that in the inguinal region. More posterior to that is the uterine tube. Try to straighten this out so you can see the parts of the uterine tube, all the way to the fimbriated end and back to its attachment to the fundus of the uterus, surrounded by peritoneum. And then even more posterior to the uterine tube is the ovary, which you see right here. Again, peritoneum connecting uterine tube to the ovary. There's another ligament that goes from the inferior pole of the ovary down to attach to the side wall of the uterus. This is the ovarian ligament, or the proper ovarian ligament, as it's sometimes called, to differentiate it from a ligament that continues up into the abdominal cavity. The structures that course through this other ligament, right in here, the suspensory ligament of the ovary, bringing in the ovarian artery and draining blood through the ovarian vein, as well as lymphatics and autonomics. Okay, all of these structures are associated with the broad ligament, which is the peritoneal reflection that goes from the uterus to the lateral body wall. The other thing you should do is just open the urinary bladder to look in and confirm the cavity. Usually it's very thick-walled as the post-mortem and embalming process lead to a thickening and collapsing of the urinary bladder. And we'll get a better view of that when we do the transection. So the next step will be to bisect the pelvis into right and left halves. First step in splitting or bisecting the pelvis is to take a scalpel and cut through all of the viscera, making a nice, clean, sharp cut. And in this case,
All right, so he's going to just go through and do this. All right, so here we go.
Okay, having completed the splitting or bisecting of the pelvis, let me give you some orientation of what we can look at here. Here is the sacrum, sacral promontory coming down towards the coccyx right about here. Pubic symphysis anterior. So the plane of the pelvic outlet would be right across there. And the pelvic rim would be up in this region. And you can see the couple of organs of viscera here in the midline that we can identify the structures, the urinary bladder, and that continues down into the urethra, which continues down through the urogenital diaphragm, which would be about in that plane right underneath the pubic symphysis, so the membranous part of the urethra there. Just posterior to that would be the uterus with the fundus and the body here, the cervix down in this region. And this would be the vesico-uterine pouch. And looking more carefully at the cervical region of the uterus, you can on this specimen identify the ostium, the cervix, which continues through into the cavity of the body of the uterus. The vagina is right here, continuing inferiorly. Posterior wall leading up to a posterior fornix, which is right here. This is the area that's close to the rectouterine pouch. The anterior fornix would be tracing the anterior wall up, and a cul-de-sac right in here. Okay. And then posteriorly is the rectum becoming the anal canal. Not really obvious here, but there's about a 90-degree turn, the rectum being in this orientation and the anal canal being in this orientation. To continue the dissection on this side, we'll look at the vascular system first, and then.
All right, so yeah, the rest of that just goes into the blood vessels and the nerves. Although actually, I want you to see the perineum. Hold on, I forgot that. Let me get back to where we were. Where to go? So 11:20. If you remember, this was the one last time we saw him like cut the penis on the guy. Okay.
Okay, now switching to the female external genitalia. The mons pubis is anteriorly here, and down deep through the fatty tissue would be the pubic symphysis. Labia majora on both sides here. If you pull back the labia majora, you can see folds that usually in the cadaver are collapsed or compressed more, are the labia minora that bound the vestibule between the labia minora on the right and left sides. And then you look in this area within the vestibule, and this is the position of the glands of the clitoris. The vaginal orifice is down in this position, and the urethral opening is in between the two, right, approximately right there. Posteriorly, the labia minora come together again into the skin that you see here that marks the surface landmark for the perineal body, in which episiotomies may be done midline through this area or medial lateral off to the side. With this specimen, you can again see the vestibular area in here between labia minora here, and on the right side, the labia majora has been removed. The glands of the clitoris is right here, and when we fold this way, we can see the continuity of the glands of the clitoris, which is right here, with the shaft or body of the clitoris, which makes almost a 90-degree turn down this way to become the right crus, since we're looking at the right side of the clitoris. Okay, so labia minora and majora were basically removed except for this flap right here on this side. The crus in the female, like the male, is covered by a thin sheet-like muscle that's usually atrophied in the older specimens, which is called the ischiocavernosus muscle. So you usually see remnants, and underneath the muscle is the erectile tissue of the crus of the clitoris. More towards the midline or centrally located, you'll see other bands of skeletal muscle fibers that run in a vertical direction, the way I'm showing with the pointer, and this is the bulbospongiosus muscle of the female covering the bulb of the vestibule. The position in between the bulb of the vestibule and the crus and pushing in deep in this direction would push against the urogenital diaphragm in the female. And the urogenital diaphragm in the female is identical to that of the male, being a sheet of skeletal muscle pierced by urethra, the difference being it's also pierced by the vaginal canal. Now we're going to quickly run through the neurovascular structures on the female.
All right, so that we don't need to do. Okay, let's stop sharing. All right, so that kind of gives you an idea of what this stuff looks like. And it's actually the, yeah, in fact, our female cadaver actually didn't even have a uterus, so we wouldn't have been able to actually see the real uterus. We think that maybe she was used as a practice for like a hysterectomy or something for some med students before we got her. But Do you have your hand up, Jamba? Oh, I saw you like. Um, so what? Yeah, what is a hysterectomy?
You remove the uterus.
Yeah, so that's removing of the uterus. So typically, like if that's a pretty extreme thing to do. Typically, what would be the equivalent of a vasectomy for a woman?
Tying the fallopian tubes.
Yeah, tying off the fallopian tube, so like a tubal ligation. But that's still a lot more invasive than a vasectomy because you have to get inside the woman's pelvic cavity. Often if a woman is having a cesarean delivery or something, she'll have an option. Like if this is your last kid, do you want to have a tubal ligation while we're at it? So you don't have to do that as a secondary thing. And hysterectomy, even though we're going back, is we can talk about language and talk about the external genitalia being pudenda and being shameful. We can also think about hysterectomy. That root is actually just about being female. Like this whole idea of hysterical. It didn't come hysteria and hysterical isn't about. It's about when they were. How did it work? And like kind of these kind of old psychological like writings, it's like, oh, this person is acting so crazy just because it's a woman. But that word hysterical, hysteria doesn't come from like crazy. It comes from woman, which is just also kind of ridiculous. Yeah, ridiculous.
Doesn't it mean wandering womb?
Well, I don't know, wander. I think it just means like womb. I don't know about wandering. I could be wrong there. I think like a hysterectomy is just like removal of the womb. So yeah, I don't know. So what else can we talk about here? Again, next class, what we'll do is, in fact, I'll show you. Let's go through a few. I can review some of the stuff briefly with the PowerPoint stuff because I actually brought those out just to double go over some stuff to make sure that.
Yeah, it was the idea of hysteria was caused by the thought that it was a wandering womb by ancient Greek writers. So it was like that was like the origin of the concept of hysteria.
A wander. I don't know what even that would mean exactly. A wandering womb. All right. So let me. Oh, I know what I want to show you. All right. So the idea. Speaking of womb, if you're pregnant, the womb is going to start expanding pretty dramatically because the baby is in there. And I'm going to show you some pictures just to give you a sense of how ridiculous it gets. So this is showing, to start, just this idea that you've got your uterus here, and for the first few months, the baby is really little, or I should say the fetus is really dinky, and it doesn't really change the size of things all that much. So it's still staying down here. This is showing the fundus of the uterus at 3 months. At 4 months, it's like reaching up to the level of your belly button. But then by the end of the second trimester, by the time you're getting to full term, the uterus is filling up all of this. So if you like look at what this looks like from the side, normally here's the uterus. In fact, maybe use a darker one. Normally here's the little uterus, Here are your intestines hanging off their mesenteries. Here's your stomach. Here's your bladder. It's all good. All of a sudden, this is the uterus. There's the poor little bladder. So it's like not shocking that women who are pregnant have to pee all the time because they've got this big thing just pushing down on their bladder. It's not surprising that they often have a lot of indigestion because they got this thing just totally squishing all of their intestines in their stomach. So just to give you an idea of how radically things have to kind of shift around to make room for this little developing thing. Yeah, and it has to somehow get out of like the os is generally, again, the width of a hair. But, during that going through labor, that's what that dilation is. It has to get bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually it's big enough for the baby to make it out. So again, we're going to talk about all of this stuff on Thursday to kind of end the whole process. So let me stop that. So are there any comments or questions about any of this stuff?
I have a question about the test next week. Is it going to be broken up into like different sections, like kind of exam 1, exam 2, and then
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be, and in the old days, it would be the lab exam first because I have to have it set up and then we break it down. But since we're all doing it online, it probably makes sense to just keep it lecture and then lab. So it'll be, we'll meet at our normal time and we'll do the lab, not the lab, the lecture test, and take a break and then do the lab part. And if you have not got to the Pearson thing, there's a few of you who haven't got to all of them. They're not like a big part of the grade, but they are part of the grade. And I'm starting to get them more formally integrated into the Canvas thing. So I am going to, part of being able to barely stay afloat is I have not been grading consistently like I would have liked to. But over the next 2 weeks, I'm going to obviously have to finish grading everything. So if you could make sure stuff is there. So it's there when I grade it. And plus the Pearson stuff's going to be helpful when you're getting ready for the exam. If you haven't done all of them, and I think I'm going to do my best to have one more created for the reproductive system as well, because I think it actually is really useful in preparing for the exams. Yeah, so then next class, again, we're going to talk not a whole lot of detail, but some detail about what happens actually if an egg gets fertilized by a sperm, and just kind of the first stages and how the whole placenta works and everything. And then we'll just spend the rest of Thursday reviewing. And in terms of today, again, normally lab is, you guys should be checking this stuff out on your own. So at this point, I think that's probably what makes sense is you've got a lot of things to work on. You've got all of the gross anatomy, the histology. But I think I've said all that I have to say.